George Applin Jr. was a witness to the arrest of Oswald at the Texas Theater, and he's important because there are three aspects of the case that he's important to, and the first one is the time of arrest. Now, this is his first statement. It was made on November 22nd, 1963, the day of the incident referred to. It's short, so I'll just read it. On Friday evening, November 22nd, 1963, at about 1:45 p.m., I was seated on the main floor of the Texas Theater on West Jefferson in Dallas, Texas. As I watched the movie, I saw an officer walking down the aisle with a riot gun, and about that time the light came on in the theater. One of the patrolmen walked down to the front of the theater and walked back up the aisle, and I got up and started walking toward the front of the theater. I saw the officer shake two men down and then ask a man sitting by himself to stand up. As the officer started to shake him down, and when he did, this boy took a swing at the officer, and then the next thing I could see was this boy had his arm around the officer's left shoulder and had a pistol in his hand. I heard the pistol snap at least once. Then I saw a large group of officers subdue this boy and arrest him. What I'm dealing with first here is the time of arrest. And so he wasn't looking at his watch, but he says about 1:45 p.m. in the afternoon that the incident began. And then on December 1st, he signs an affidavit for the Secret Service, and he says the same thing with regard to the time. At about 1:45, during the introduction of the next movie, the house lights in the theater came on. So this is consistent with his November 22nd affidavit. And chronologically, we come now to the third one. This is the December 16th document produced by the FBI as a report of their interview with Applin. And this one is different. He doesn't give the time that the incident started, but he presents a chronology. At first, he says he went to the Texas Theater. He stated just prior to entering the theater at approximately 12:45, he overheard on his car radio that President Kennedy had just been shot. So he enters the theater at 12:45. Applin advised that the movie started at approximately 1 p.m., and that the main feature started approximately 20 minutes later, so that would be 1:20 p.m. approximately. And following the news and the cartoon, he said that after approximately 10 minutes of the main feature, the lights in the theater went on, and the incident began. Now, he doesn't say what time it was, but if you just follow along the chronology presented, you come up with 1:30. Not 1:45. Now, of course, he wasn't watching the clock, looking at his watch, but I think it's interesting that we have the first two statements saying the incident began at 1:45, and a third statement essentially saying it began at 1:30. And I think this is important because I think there's a lot of other information that indicates that it was really about 1:30, but that's beyond the scope of this video. Now, the reliability of Applin's chronology is somewhat corroborated by the actual timing from the movie theater. This is a programmed time schedule of for the week, November 21st and November 27th at the Texas Theater. And the show starts at 1 o'clock, just as Applin said. The main feature starts at 1:20, just as Applin said. So he's right on the nose when he's talking about when he heard JFK was shot and he entered the theater, when the movie started, 1 o'clock, and then when the feature started at 1:20. So I think this is good evidence that George Applin is fairly accurate in his chronology, and I think that supports the 1:30 time, not the 1:45 time. So to summarize this point, I've put all parts of all three statements on here with the times indicated and with that program time schedule. And as I say, the time of Oswald's arrest is much more complex because there's a recording of the radio traffic at the time which indicates that the arrest occurred after 1:45, around 1:50. So it's a complicated argument, but I'm not going to get into that here. The point of this video, or this part of the video, is simply to say, in my opinion, that the better time to be interpreted from this evidence is 1:30, because the account, even though we have two statements of 1:45, the account as explained chronologically fits more with the 1:30. I wouldn't rely on this to be the only element in proving the arrest time, but I think it's an important element that comes from the testimony of George Applin. And the next Applin point I deem to be important is this. Mr. Ball asks him, and then when they went out, did they come out through the doors? He's talking about the police officers taking Oswald out. And Applin says, yes, sir, they came up through, and one of the officers hollered out, don't let nobody see him. And they came right behind me. Now, I deem this to be important because this confirms what Officer Hudson told the Warren Commission. Officer Hudson said, part of what he said anyway, is then Captain Westbrook came in and gave the order to get him out of here as fast as you can and don't let anybody see him, and he was rushed out of the theater. So I take this as a fact because Hudson says it happened and he names Captain Westbrook. Applin, of course, didn't know Captain Westbrook, but he says the same thing was said. So, and I regard this as important because I think there's evidence in the photography that the Dallas police were trying to either hide Oswald or hide some aspect of him, and I think particularly it's the shirt. Even though in the photography you can see the motorcycle officer apparently trying to hide his face with C.T. Walker's hat, I think really what Captain Westbrook was concerned with was the shirt. But I'll leave it at that. I think this is just another important point in Hudson's accounts. And the last thing I want to cover with George Applin is what he said when Mr. Ball was trying to say bye-bye. Okay, fine, that is all, Mr. Applin. But there is one thing puzzling me. What is that? And I don't even know if it has any bearing on the case, but there was one guy sitting in the back row right where I was standing at, and I said to him, buddy, you'd better move, there's a gun. And he says, just sat there. He was just back like this, just watching the show. And keep in mind that the movie is not on now. It's what's going on that Mr. Ball is talking about. Or I assume that's what he should be talking about anyway. And Mr. Applin says, no, I don't think he could have seen the show. Just sitting like this, just looking at me. Did you know the man? No, I didn't. Ever seen him since? No, sir, I didn't. I tapped him on the shoulder and I said, buddy, you'd better move. And, were you scared? Well, when I seen the gun I was. Did you tell the police officer about this man? No, sir. At the time, I didn't think about it. But I didn't even think about it when I went before the Secret Service man. But I did tell one of the FBI men about it. And if you look at the FBI report we have, that is not mentioned in the report. Now, when I first noticed this, I thought it was significant because I thought maybe there was, one of the Secret Service guys who was managing the assassination events, or maybe a Dallas police officer, maybe James H. Taylor, the Dallas police officer who was in the theater out of uniform, according to my analysis. But it turns out that in 1979, George Applin expounded upon this man. In this Earl Goltz article, Earl Goltz interviewed him, and he said he recounts the Warren Commission thing I just went over. And then he says what he didn't tell him, what Applin didn't tell them, however, was that he recognized Jack Ruby as one of about 4 main floor patrons not identified by the Warren Commission. So, 15 years later, he said it was Jack Ruby. Now, he had, when it occurred, he didn't know Jack Ruby. That is on November 22nd. But by the time he talks to the Secret Service and to the Warren Commission, of course, he would know it was Jack Ruby because he's seen Jack Ruby on TV and in the newspapers after shooting Oswald. Now, when I first noticed this, I thought, well, it's probably just something he made up afterwards or convinced himself he saw. But I'm not so sure now. I think, Goltz in this article, he ponders the timing of it because Jack Ruby supposedly was seen at Parkland Hospital by Seth Cantor and Wilma Tice. And I don't know what he says here, but Seth Cantor's first word on it was that it was about 1:30 that he saw Jack Ruby at Parkland Hospital. Anyway, Earl Goltz, going with the times he uses, that is, what's he say here? He goes through a lot of times. I don't want to go through that because the video isn't really about that. But I think there's a possibility that Seth Cantor picked 1:30 to have, or was told to pick 1:30 to have Jack Ruby at Parkland Hospital, because that would mean that he couldn't have been at the Texas Theater at 1:30, which, as I explained in this video, I think is the real time of Oswald's arrest. The time that Applin saw the guy, Jack Ruby, sitting there. So I'm not so sure now. I think it might really have been Jack Ruby at the Texas Theater, and that a red herring was put out about him being at Parkland Hospital. But I'm not going to go further into that because that would be its own video. And just to finish up here, going back to Applin's Warren Commission testimony, Mr. Ball asked him if he'd ever been in trouble with the law, and it turns out he had been apparently apprehended, and I guess you'd be convicted because he is on probation, and it was a 1963 event. So probably at the time of the assassination and the Texas Theater arrest of Oswald, he was probably on probation. And so this, I mention this because if you're on probation for a crime committed in Dallas, you might be vulnerable to the Dallas police. And that might explain why he gave the 1:45 time. It might explain why we don't hear about Jack Ruby being in the theater until 1979. Of course, I don't know that to be true for certain, but I think it's a possible explanation. In any case, I think Mr. Applin is an important witness for the reasons I have stated in this video.